obviously I have huge sympathy with these athletes because they're not Putin. They didn't make the decision to go to war. It's hard to know what Russian athletes think of the war because, you know, they know that they would be in trouble if they were to oppose it. So we don't really know what they think. And but having said that, we do know that boycotting, these kind of boycotts do work. So during apartheid South Africa, there was a boycott of South African goods. And it did help create pressure to end apartheid. So I suppose I have quite mixed opinions on this because I do think it is unfair on those athletes and on all of the other people who have found themselves not performing. For example, musicians have been told they can't perform and things like that. I think it is deeply unfair. But I do understand the reasons behind it. It's to isolate Russia and to create a situation where the war is untenable and to make Putin unpopular with his own people. So I understand it, but obviously these people have, as far as we know, we don't know what their views are, but have done nothing wrong, and it's really unfortunate that they've had to suffer in this way because of the actions of their president. Yeah,
Charlotte, what do you think?
I think it's appalling.
What's appalling?
And I think it's appalling that they are being stopped, banned from playing at Wimbledon. And I think it's really, really important here that we make a distinction between the state of Russia, Putin and anyone who is enabling him and, supporting his war. And then whether you call it ordinary Russians or, let's put, an elite athlete is clearly not quite an ordinary person, but let's put them in that category. And I think it's really important we split those things. And there are ways of enabling Russian athletes to compete at the highest level, which wouldn't require you to endorse the Russian flag, the Russian state. So, for example, a completely different issue, but at the Olympics, we had a ban on Russia competing in the Olympics due to the drug scandal. So Russian athletes can compete under a neutral banner. So there's no reason why that couldn't have been implemented here. And the thing that I guess worries me the most about this is actually there's a risk that Ellie's right. On one side, maybe by banning athletes, you do somehow encourage the Russian people to put greater pressure and hopefully, in some way to topple Putin. But actually the flip of that is that you further cement this idea that the West are anti-Russian. And that's really dangerous because the war will end at some point. What we need from that is a Russia that can come out of it looking very different and actually being brought into the fold, not being rejected. And given all of the anti-Western propaganda we know is already going on in Russia, I think we've got a risk of feeding into this by banning legitimate athletes. And it's not true to say that the athletes haven't, or at least some of them haven't said something, because there was precisely a Russian elite tennis player who, at one of the matches, forgive me, I forget which one it was, actually wrote on the screen an anti-war slogan. So I think
it's really... But the flip side of that, wasn't it a gymnast? And I have to confess, I'm going from memory here, I've not thingied it, but wasn't it a gymnast that he had a Z?
Yeah.
On his chest.
But then you would say, well, that gymnast, in the model where you say you can't stand under the Russian flag because it's the state, the Russian state we want to see as and is a pariah, then that gymnast, if they were to show, I think, an affiliation to the state, and that is a proxy affiliation, then I think you would be legitimate in saying, do you know what, you can't compete now. But for those athletes who want to just get on with their sport, want to be able to compete and are happy to compete in a neutral stance, then I think we should be welcoming that.
Kevin?
I think we're losing the plot. Absolutely losing the plot.
Wimbledon,
Wimbledon. Banning Russian individual players because of a political situation in Ukraine, I think it's irrational. I think it's anti-Russian hysteria at its worst. I think it's Russophobia. And when you target individuals like that, let me be very clear, Michelle, and not mince my words, and I know what I'm saying, I've thought it through. The English Tennis Law Association, whatever you call the tennis people who organise Wimbledon, they are racist. You are pure and absolute racist. This is racism of the worst kind. We are taking individual Russian people because of their nationality and we are banning them. Now, the point that you just made, Charlotte, is well made. One of the leading players took a pen onto the actual camera and said, give peace a chance. actively oppose Putin's war, and we're turning them all with the same brush. Now, here's the point, Michelle. Once you do this with Russian players, this is one slippery slope you're on. Where does this end? Now, everybody wanted to criticise sections of the left when they engaged in boycotts of Israel and boycotts and diverse sanctions, etc. And I understand why they were criticising those left-wing academics. But now you have a situation where, in a much more high-profile case, we're doing the exact same to Russian people. This is a disaster, and it makes me worry about the whole idea of sanctions. It's making me really rethink where we're at. I struggle to be even one iota sympathetic towards this ban, and I'm fascinated to know what the average listeners think about this.
But what about what Ellie was saying there? She mentioned in terms of it happening when there was apartheid and it being quite successful and changing.
Ella May's completely wrong about
Players weren't
apartheid.
bad.
By the way, apartheid's wrong.
Yeah.
It's completely not true. This is one of these historical myths. I mean, you know, if you want to read a few history books about apartheid South Africa, the boycotts were absolutely nothing to do with why we ended apartheid in South Africa. Absolutely zero. It was to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was to do with the problem within the ANC. It was to do with de Klerk picking the right moment to draw them into negotiations. I'm happy to have a conversation about South Africa. And by the way, here's a really interesting question. You know, if it worked...
There's other examples of boycotts.
Fair enough, Ella May, but you can have a conversation about, well, might this work? But even if you thought it would work, I'd still be against it. It is racist. It's pure and absolute racist against ordinary Russian people who are individuals who think all different things.
But then I suspect that you would not approve of, because I have to say this is something that I find incredibly bizarre. This is UK's Sports Minister, Nigel Huddleston. He was saying at one point that Russian players should provide, I quote, written assurances that they don't support and are not in collusion with Vladimir Putin. I've got to be honest, I find that a bit weird.
So let's put a big target on their chest or on their back. Can you imagine those players coming out with those statements and then having to go back home to their families? The guy's obviously exactly what I mean by people losing the plot.
Well, Ellie, what was you going to say?
No, I think that's really unfair to ask those players to do that, because I agree with Kevin. You're setting them up in an impossible situation. Then either they withdraw from the tournament they want to be in, or they risk making themselves a target for the Putin administration. I think that's a completely unrealistic demand. I think they should have a consistent. I think the sports bodies should have a consistent policy on how to handle this situation, and it should not involve putting athletes in the firing line like that. I think that's completely unfair.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.